Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started and hope Reggie joins at some point. Lene, we have you queued up first anyway, so this works well. Welcome back, everybody, to session 2 of our Climate Justice and Environmental Racism workshop. Lene, we won't take the 30 minutes required to do introductions, but you got the list of participating journalists, so hopefully you've had a chance to see a little bit of who you're talking to and the fact that they're all over the country. We just had a session with a couple of young climate leaders and activists who are working towards change, and I thought that set up the table nicely for these topics that we're now going to start covering. So for our participating reporters, what we were hoping to do is sort of focus on 3 or 4, known climate impacts that are going to affect communities across the country, probably where your beat is as well, at least some of them, and then take that kind of national view of these issues and then zoom in on a specific location to see what the story is there, what's going on the ground. So first out of the gate is the issue of extreme heat. I'm sure everyone's seen maps of what projections are for their part of the world and how the temperature is rising and likely to continue to rise. And our Phoenix-based reporters have already talked some about that. And so what we wanted to do here, there's Reggie joining us right now, is hear first from Lene, whose area of expertise is this issue at a broader scale, and then hear from Reggie, who is based in Phoenix, and a community organizer and public school teacher there who's working hard to help mitigate extreme heat impacts in his community. So I'll give you guys the brief bios of both of our speakers. Reggie, welcome, and Lene, welcome. And we will then turn it over to you, Lene, to get us going. So Lene Turek-Hankins is a doctoral candidate in the ABIS, Environmental Science and Policy Graduate Program at the University of Miami. She studies how infrastructure and policy can promote resilience and equity under changing climate conditions. She's a contributing member to the Resilient 305 initiative, the Miami-Dade County Climate and Heat Health Task Force, and a chapter author for an upcoming 5th National Climate Assessment. So Lene, we're thrilled to have you and to hear about some of your research. Reggie, I believe, yeah, there he is down there, okay, serves as the elected Phoenix element, or serves as an elected Phoenix Elementary Governing School Board member, an elementary school teacher in the Phoenix public school system, and is founder of AZ Land, that's Arizona, AZ, and in parentheses, LAND. It's a local grassroots nonprofit with the vision to co-create environmentally and racially just communities where inhabitants can thrive. Reggie saw early in his life the inequities that exist when it comes to the development of our barrios, or their barrios in Arizona. His formal understanding of his childhood inequities began in college when he was able to begin researching environmental justice issues like heat island effects, food deserts, water scarcity, and the need for green spaces. Reggie's focused on environmental equity, the future of education, technology, and closing disparity gaps in historically excluded communities. He's aspiring to obtain his PhD in innovation and global development, and his current ambitions include focusing on co-developing environmentally and racially just communities. So we're really excited to have both of you. I will now stop talking so that you can share your screen, Lene, and get us going.
Awesome. First of all, can everybody hear me? Sometimes my mic has an issue, so I think we're good.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, perfect. And also, I did look at all of your bios, which is very exciting. Saw there's a couple of people come from the Southeast like me, which was really fun. And I also noticed somebody was from Reno, and I'm from Reno, so shout out to the Reno person. All right, so hi everybody. As was introduced, my name is Lene. I am a doctoral candidate at the Abbott Center for Environmental Science and Policy. My work is funded by the National Science Foundation Graduate Research fellowship program. So thank you to them for providing money. And today I will be chatting with you guys about really thinking through what adaptation and response can start to look like when we start to think about multi-sector impacts of extreme heat. And one of the reasons I'm really going to try to zoom in a little bit more on thinking about heat as a multi-sectoral hazard is because, as was introduced, I'm working on the National Climate Assessment chapter on complex systems. And one of the things we're really interested in is starting to think about how can we start to really inject this complex systems perspective into how we're talking about the climate change problem. So that's going to be kind of influencing a little bit how I am producing this content and talking about this content. And so hopefully you guys are interested in thinking about this issue from that angle and pushing that angle forward as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at any point and stop me. I don't know, since this is a workshop, I'm more comfortable with this being informal if you guys want it to be like that. Otherwise, we can wait for questions at the end.
Yeah, do not feel free to reach out and interrupt her.
Okay, then never mind. Don't interrupt.
We'll let Lene
we'll
and
this nice
Reggie.
in the 15 minutes.
Yeah, we'll get to plenty of questions. Don't worry.
Okay, sounds great. So then I'll do my spiel. So we're going to start just with the projections because I think that's a really good place to ground us in this conversation about extreme heat. One of the things that's really strong about the extreme heat projections is heat is a temperature problem, right? And one of the things we are very good at modeling in the future is temperature. So it's actually some of the strongest projections that we have is when we're thinking about extreme heat as a future issue. And when we're thinking about heat, there's so many different ways to kind of measure what is an extreme heat event. So for example, where I am right now in Miami, Florida, we don't really have heat waves. We have chronic heat. Like it's pretty much always hot all the time. And the projection is that it's just going to get even more hot all the time. And that is just fundamentally different from somewhere like New York City or Philadelphia, where the hazard is more episodic. Like we're concerned about heat waves and people who are more comfortable and more acclimatized to lower temperatures than all of a sudden having to deal with hot temperatures. And so when we're starting to think about projections, I have two different maps here. On the left, we have the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. On the right, we have the projected change in the warmest temperature. So that is relative to the local climate of where the map is. Both of those are going to be increasing in the future. And I think another component of this that is often not discussed, again, we're trying to think about how our system's connected, how is it not just the episodic heat event, but potentially trickles cascade down the road from that as well, is that it's also going to start getting warmer in the winter. And so when we start to think about places like the Mountain West, this is really important for things like snowpack, dryness, and drought, again, complex hazards, and what role is heat playing, not only on its own, but as this stressor in complex systems that we're dealing with. So across the board, heat is going to become really a significant problem by mid-century for sure, by end of century, really huge issue. And again, this can look like heat with other hazards. So I think a really good example is drought. And we could see that fairly recently. A big one that comes to mind is the 2012 drought, where that was a huge issue for people dealing with livestock and the crops themselves. And that had a lot of economic repercussions and repercussions outside of the United States too, right? Thinking about how these systems are all connected. We have seen issues with heat after hurricanes and after emergency events, or as being a problem with emergency events. So the one that immediately comes to mind for me is the Surfside condo collapse, because that happened here in my backyard in Miami-Dade. And so this problem there being that after the collapse, a lot of the workers had to wear protective equipment, and that was really dangerous for them in the heat. And so with hurricanes, we see if there's something like a power outage, which is what happened in Hurricane Laura, people were really at risk because you can't go outside, you're sheltering in place. There's a lot of physical debris that is dangerous for you after a storm. But if you're trapped inside without air conditioning, that can be really dangerous too. And so we're starting to see heat emerge as a stressor for other events that are not necessarily heat events. And then another one that I think is really important from the climate perspective is the intersection of heat and wildfire, not only the fire themselves as a contributor to drying out grass, increasing the chance of fire happening, but the smoke component. And one of the things we know about health and heat impacts is that it's really respiratory effects can be really dangerous. So, and that becomes an exacerbating factor. And so when we think about people like outdoor workers who are maybe in the Central Valley in California, exposed not only to heat, but also wildfire smoke, we're starting to deal with kind of these compounding hazards where, you know, the equipment to deal with the wildfire smoke is maybe making it hotter for the person. So how do you then start to balance different adaptation measures when we're layering hazards on top of each other? And so stepping it back a little bit, my background actually is mechanical engineering. I got my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering and did building energy modeling for a little bit. And so my approach to thinking about this issue is a little bit more focused on households and thinking about at the household level, what are ways either policy or direct adaptations can be used to make heat less of a danger indoors. And so I tend to think about heat from this nexus. This is just where my expertise is, and that is thinking about the intersection between housing, energy, and the built environment. The housing component really comes in through the structure itself. So if you are living in a poorly maintained home, if your home has no insulation, you know, or if the appliances are really old. So maybe, for example, your air conditioning unit is really not up to snuff, or you just have really energy inefficient appliances that produce a lot of heat when you run them. That's going to increase your heat exposure indoors. Here we have a map of Miami-Dade County, which again is where I'm from, or where I'm currently based. And this is from the Department of Energy low-income energy affordability data set. And it's showing the percent of money people are spending on their utility bills relative to their income. So we call that energy burden in academia jargon, but basically just means how much of your money are you spending on your energy bill each month. And energy burden households are usually considered households that are spending 6% or more of their income. And this comes into play with the heat component because actually recent research from 2021, Wilhelmi et al. Showed that 1/5 of Americans have air conditioning, but are not able to effectively cool their homes. So, and a big component of that was that people were not able to use as much electricity as they want to be able to effectively do that. And so the energy component really is a big question there in terms of, are you able to use fans? Are you able to use AC? Different things like that. And then the last bit of it is the built environment. And so maybe it's the case that you live in an updated home, a weatherized home, and you're able to afford your energy bill, but you are spending more money and using more energy than you would need to because your outside environment is not conducive to cool temperatures. And so what that could look like is maybe you are living in an urban space that is really built out. We've seen a lot of this kind of research thinking about redlining. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And here we have two images from here again in Miami, Google Street View. At the top, we have a wealthy community here in Miami, really wonderful, strong, dense urban canopy. And in contrast, we have one of our low-income communities in Miami, basically no canopy and very built out with asphalt and heat-retaining surfaces. And it's really not hard to imagine if you're standing on those sidewalks, which one's going to be hotter and which one's going to be colder, right? And so it could look like the urban heat island effect, or urban archipelago, as we call it, when there's differences between neighborhoods, or it could look like where are we siting anthropogenic producing infrastructure? So infrastructure that's basically producing heat. So where are freeways? You know, where is our transmission infrastructure? And so that is also another component we think about the built environment contributing to making it hot indoors for people. And then again, kind of circling back to the hazard itself, there is compounding hazards, but then there are the compounding effects of people's responses to the hazard. And that is kind of also making the hazard potentially more difficult. So I think a really good example of this that I noticed firsthand was I was actually in Seattle during the Pacific Northwest heat wave last year in 2021. And my family lives up there and we didn't have air conditioning. And so we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do. And one of the options we were considering was going to a hotel. And then we looked and the prices for hotels was just bonkers because a lot of people were in our same position. And so the prices just went up in response to the demand for people looking for air conditioning spaces. And so there was, in a way, the response of people trying to deal with the heat created other problems. And so it's not only the hazards you have to think about in a way of kind of creating these cascading effects, but people and the way people respond to the hazards as well. And so this all kind of ties into histories of racism and histories of harm happening to low-income communities, disadvantaged communities. I think a really good example of this that is well researched is redlining. Redlining was a historic practice in which the federal government basically chose to invest in certain communities and not invest in others. And the communities they chose to invest in were primarily white, wealthy, not were brown and Black communities. And this has had really lasting impacts. One, on exposure. People have associated higher temperatures between communities that were redlined versus not, but also in their ability to respond, right? So really cool work from people like Tony Reams have shown that it's actually harder to get certain kinds of technologies, such as like energy efficient light bulbs, if you are in these kinds of communities. So it has important implications, not only from the exposure standpoint, but from the adaptation standpoint. And then I think another great example from the energy justice side of things is that a lot of the harm from our energy system, has again happened primarily in low-income Black, brown communities. And when we are responding as a society to heat, a lot of times that means blasting air conditioning, and that often means, then we are producing more pollution at these places, and the pollution is primarily in these disadvantaged communities, especially if we're turning on things like peaker plants, which are the dirtiest plants that we have. And then the other side of that, again, is the adaptation side. So where are our clean energy solutions happening, particularly things like solar, which actually have potential not only for mitigation, but for heat adaptation. So like, again, thinking about when there's a power outage, who can kind of keep the power on and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways in which environmental justice is intimately tied to the issue, both from an adaptation, but also from a mitigation standpoint. And I just want to quickly, before I head out with my presentation and we transition to the other speaker, really encourage you guys to think about adaptation happening across social and geographical scales. And that is like, how does adaptation is happening at the individual level? Maybe that looks like people using certain kind of protective equipment. I did a systematic review looking at heat adaptation that was happening globally. And one of the things we saw was that people would change jobs if it was too hot outside. And I think there's a lot of implications there in terms of what does it mean for places in habitually hot climates where a lot of their workers are not wanting to do that work anymore because it's too hot outside. So again, thinking about what these ripple effects are. The adaptations happening at the household level. This is much kind of the focus of much of my work, thinking about things like weatherization, updating homes, and then heat is happening at the community level. So maybe it's social adaptation. So this is a little flyer from the Massachusetts Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and in which they're kind of like encouraging social cohesion as a way of responding to heat through people checking on neighbors and things like that. We see adaptation at the city and regional level. So I'm involved in Miami-Dade County's Heat Health Task Force, which is really the goal is to try to think about how to integrate a bunch of the different counties' programs to kind of think about heat holistically and start to fill in gaps that are existing in terms of services. And then obviously heat adaptation is happening at the national level. We're seeing a lot of movement on this from the current administration in terms of things like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Also, Justice 40 is a big one from the climate justice angle. But I will leave it at that. I'm really looking forward to your questions and this discussion. So I will stop sharing.
All right. Thanks so much, Lenny. Reggie, there you are.
Hey,
And did you have anything to share slide-wise, or?
no, I didn't have a slide. I'm just kind of gonna speak from experience, and
That works. All right.
so 15 minutes, right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is IJNR. You could call me Reggie if you have a hard time twisting your tongue around that. So I go by Reggie. I was asked to speak about the work that we do in terms of the environmental justice work that we do and racial justice work that we do, and then also speak about kind of how I experienced everything as a community resident too, also living in these communities where also our organization is also doing this work, growing up in these communities of color, under-resourced communities too, and my experience with dealing with journalists and other media outlets too, as an elected official doing this work too. So I'll go ahead and just share my story. So thank you for the opportunity, Adam, to present and talk to everyone about the work we're doing and the impact I hope, positive outcomes I hope happen after this, and stuff just to put on your radar. So again, my name is Reggie Carrillo. I am someone who grew up in Almiraj, Surprise, which is a community of color, underserved community, under-resourced community. And I very much saw that as a child. As it was in my bio, I was able to observe, analyze, parse, even though I didn't have that terminology, that my community lacked resources. It was obvious to me as a kid. And that instilled in me shame, guilt, about who I was, about my identity and connection with the land, about my ancestors and what my elders were teaching me about the land, living in the Sonoran Desert, which is one of the most biodiverse deserts in the world, right? But when people move to Arizona, they think of the Sahara Desert, and those are actually comments like, "Oh, this is a different desert than I thought it was going to be." And I do love hearing that. It's bittersweet, but that's part of what led me on the work that I did, is changing my mindset as a kid, growing up with that guilt. I was able to go to high school. My family became transient, and so I kind of bounced around through my high school and college years. And then I was able to go to college because the only stability I really had in my education, or the only community asset that I had in my life, was public education, were my teachers who helped stabilize my life, put me on that path to success. I started doing research about obesity, food deserts in New Zealand and Fiji. Was a research assistant, and very much that's where I was able to have access to that knowledge that I needed about who I was, about the community I grew up in, and the issue that my community was facing in college. After that, I became a teacher. I started teaching at a public charter. I started teaching middle school in South Phoenix, in a community that I also lived in and was living in. I taught there for 8 years, but it was when I started teaching middle school social studies that I really wanted to take that knowledge, that knowledge that I learned about those issues endemic to my community, those research methods, skills that I had gained, and pass them on to my students at the middle school level. So with 150 students and other experts, researchers that I had reached out to as an educator, we created what was called the Green Space Program. It was really teach our students about environmental justice, about racial justice, pack all that together, and then also give them a way, an outlet to say, how do you want your community to look with everything that you learned? So we created a 4-phase project that we called that we're calling the Body Innovation Approach, that we're researching. It's a grassroots methodological approach to impacting change in our communities, with the understanding that our communities are resilient because of the struggle we've been through, but also because of that struggle, that struggle has borne out very innovative approaches to navigating life, to navigating survival as a person of color, as a Black person, Indigenous, a Latino person, a female person, a disabled person. And so it's understanding that there's so much innovation in our communities. It's how can we tap into that innovation, amplify that innovation to address the issues that are rising, right? Address this climate crisis. From there, our program was such a success with what we taught students and the visions that they came out of, that we started AZLand, which is the nonprofit. So that 4-phase goes into building historical understandings, and in part of the work that journalism, the stories that are being told about environmental justice, I really wish that's something that would be prioritized in those storytellings of environmental issues and equities in our communities, as was talked about earlier, is that when we teach our students, that first phase is building historic understandings. Really, for me as a child being born in my community, I looked out and I saw a community that's the way things are, right? This is my life, this is the way things are, and there's nothing I can have. So I had that fatalistic view of my community, but it wasn't until I started learning about systemic racism, all this redlining segregation, that I began to understand, well, okay, a human made these decisions 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Now we can teach our students, we can teach ourselves that this isn't the way things are, that there's a human behind these decisions that created our present today, and they can be the humans that make better decisions that can impact the next 10, 20 years. So that's the first phase that we teach them. We teach them about the land that they are on. The second phase is what we call research and data collection. So our students collect research, learn about research, specific type of research called photo voice research, which is born out of struggle too. It's a way to get people closest to the problem that are most impacted by issues to go out and research their own communities and learn about these issues. So our students were researching the heat island impact, we're researching tree canopy coverage, the built environment, all that stuff that we call lack of infrastructure or infrastructure failure. What was earlier called energy burden, our students learn about energy poverty, which is something that is very endemic in South Phoenix. So they collect all that research so that when we progress them onto the third phase, which is future building, we give them a blank canvas where they can use that understanding of history, of redlining, of discrimination, coupled with the research they've collected to begin to future build, imagine a community that they want to live in. So we give them that canvas where they can have a voice and say, well, with everything that I know about these issues now, how do I want to develop my own community in a way where I've never been asked for? And so the fourth phase is the call to action. So the visions that they came up with, that they ideated, we now work to connect them with leaders, with resources where they can take those visions and turn them into tangible realities. One of those things with my students when we did that, they had came up with so many ideas. They had like little safe spots for the elote cart, men and women who come by and sell on the fruit cart. They had like Wi-Fi access. They had so much stuff, outside study sessions. One of the main things those was an increase in native desert trees, because in Arizona, being in the desert, we're suffering from water scarcity. Our states are currently on the Southwest are kind of in a fight about water rights. And then learning about their community and how there is no cement, but there are a lot of buildings. It's an industrial area. How increased tree coverage could ameliorate a lot of the rising temperatures in the community. So we went out and got funding for that call to action phase, about $14,000 to do a tree planting in the work that we do. So that's the type of work that we do. Is take them on those 4 phases, and then we're doing that with the community too. But with our interactions with journalists, I suppose some of the things that I'll put on the radar is that I wish that was being told in the story too, about prioritizing or calling out those systems of white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, naming those systems by terminology, about why our communities look the way they do, and not really glossing over those. Another thing too is I'm grateful that for me doing this work, I lived it, I grew up in it. Being here in Arizona, I feel like Bane when he's like, I was born in the dark. But for me, I was born in June. It was like the hottest month on record, like 125 degrees in 1990. And so like I was born in the heat. But so I'm very I was born here, but there are a lot of people who are more impacted by this issue. So when it comes to telling the stories of individuals most impacted by these issues, another thing too, and I always had to understand my positionality in this work that I'm doing as a light-skinned queer Mexicano, is that am I the right person to be speaking for this opportunity, for this story? So when I do speak with journalists, it's always a goal of mine to see if we can refer them to other people or some of my teammates. But as I read more and more about the stories that are being told, and I love, and I'm happy that the storytelling of environmental justice work is increasing, I do wish that there was more representation, diversity in who is being able to tell their story. And so for us, it's always about positioning, centering Black lives, Indigenous lives, queer lives, people who are living with disabilities, unhoused folks, because truly they are the most impacted by rising temperatures, by this climate crisis that we're seeing ourselves in. And then in addition, along this journey, another thing I have encountered is there's always, when someone's we do a lot of teaching our students, the community, how to tell their stories, that they have very powerful stories. We never try to put them in a box and try to get them to tell the story that we want them to tell them. And something in our experience with journalists is that they come to us with these preconceived notions of of the type of people we are. I'm someone with a master's, going in to get my PhD, and I still get pigeonholed as this poor, because I am in South Phoenix, which is one of the poorest uh, parts of the city. Still get pigeonholed as someone who really was like ignorant, and then took a course, and then like I was filled with knowledge, and then now people are coming to me as that like as someone who is like was ignorant, and now I know better, and I'm doing this work when I have been doing this work for a while. A lot of our team has, and so we get pigeonholed, and we can always tell when there's a journalist who comes to us and wants to just perpetuate those stories that the institutions that they work for want them to perpetuate, the sad case studies. And so we really, on top of just centering voices closest to the problem, making sure that whoever you're going to tell their stories are being empowered to tell the stories that they want to tell, through the lived experiences and the struggles that they've been through, without trying to pigeonhole them and trying to tell a story that you want to tell. And then also, I think another thing too, on top of systems, on top of empowering people, is understanding positionality, and who you're interviewing, and the work that they're doing. Again, for me and the research that we do, we always are transparent with our identities, sexual orientations, ethnicity, all that stuff, so people understand, again, when they're interviewing us or when we're doing the work, how close we are to these issues, and just giving perspective of the work that we're doing and who we are. And again, always relaying that we need to be centering those most impacted by the issues. But I think that if there's anything else, I can take questions. But that's all I have for you.
Thanks, Reggie. Appreciate that. And Lene as well. So folks, if you can turn your cameras back on so they can see that you're talking to a group of real life humans, we can start Q&A, and you know the drill. Just let me know in the chat when you have a question, and I'll call on you that way. So who wants to go first? They're thinking, they want really good questions. All right, Amy.
I'll throw a question out there. Redlining is something that I'm aware of, but I don't know a whole lot about it. Can you elaborate on that? And how do you identify communities in the place where you live that were redlined historically?
I can start with this one, and then Reggie, if you want to contribute as well, that would be wonderful. So in terms of the second part of your question, how do you identify redline communities? There are actually maps. So there is a website. I'm trying to remember. I think I have it on my slides. 1 second. Let me pull that up. So the National Archives and Records Administration and Mapping Inequality, I believe, Mapping Inequality is the group that has looked at all the maps. But basically what redlining was the federal government, the HUD, Housing Administration, basically creating maps and saying, this are places where we're going to have federally backed mortgages and places where we're not. And it was mortgages, but also also grants and loans for businesses too. So those two things. And so basically, if you lived in a neighborhood that was on the map, literally red, it was very difficult for you to get a mortgage, versus if you live in a place that was green or blue, determined to be low risk, it was really easy for you to get a mortgage. And so for a while, these maps existed and guided where investment was happening and who could get homes for these mortgages, as well as, again, there was the business component of it. And so what you can do is you can look up the actual maps. Most cities have them. Miami has one, Jacksonville has one, and it'll show you which neighborhoods were those ones that were in red. Those were the ones that were disinvested. They did not get those mortgages, versus green, it was really easy to get those mortgages. And so the legacy there is that because it was so easy for certain groups, certain neighborhoods to build wealth through housing, being able to get those mortgages, being able to get investments into their community, that has had the legacy. Again, my angle is kind of through the housing angle of, if your home is this protector for you of the environment, right? Like, that is kind of fundamentally what the home is. It's there to shield us from the natural elements. But your home was not invested in. Your home was really poorly taken care of for something that was outside of what you could control, just that you were not able to get mortgages, you were not able to get money to help you with that. Then your home deteriorates. So your home was poorly built in the first place. And that means that you are more exposed. So there's that exposure component. And then there's the economic component of the lack of wealth building and the kind of repercussions that had in terms of then being able to access adaptations. And then again, it's not just the housing, it's the business component. So then, it's kind of generated economic inequality through that program, because there was certain areas where housing businesses were not really invested in versus others that were really well invested in. And so I can send you, there's several really good papers that have looked at and associated temperatures. It is literally, the temperature is hotter in places that were redlined and had to deal with these being disinvested in, versus temperatures being actually lower in places that were invested in by the federal government.
So I just took a quick look here, and it looks like there aren't any redlined areas in Orlando. Would that be because Orlando is a relatively new city?
It might be. So we can chat separately offline too, if you want to talk about Orlando specifically. I'm not entirely sure. Again, this is a historic practice, not in place anymore, thankfully. But it might be that Orlando, was post, because Florida in general was developed much later. But Jacksonville definitely has one.
I would say most areas in the United States have been redlined, even Orlando. I'm Arizona, it's a very young state. We still had areas in Arizona that were redlined, and I could speak to how that happens at the local level. So the work we do is hyper local in terms of the research. When we go into communities, we try to connect that research to their community so they can learn about these practices. But here in South Phoenix, how that played out, well, in a bigger picture, Lene, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, if I mispronounce her name, Lene explained it perfectly. It was actually a practice. Redlining was actually a practice practiced by covens and real estate agents. Then was a practice taken up by the housing authority, by the government. So the housing authority, as Lene said, banks began to map out communities so they can deprive them of mortgages, and how that compounded issues as cities began to look at those maps and deprive them of resources. And so and also force people of color to move into those communities so they can continue to be ignored as what has always happened to our communities. So that's basically what redlining, how it played out in South Phoenix was, South Phoenix obviously is on the south, and then more north of that is downtown Phoenix, and more affluent communities are on the north side of Phoenix. So our streets are named after, they used to be indigenous names, but a while back they changed them to the US presidents. So where Van Buren is, and south of that is where they redlined the communities. And there's always like infrastructural demarcations, symbols for this. So the railroad tracks became a symbol of areas that were redlined. The highways were put. So when you think of stuff that more affluent communities do not want in their backyard, these are usually areas that were used as infrastructural projects to divide communities and stamp communities, right, as deserving of less. And so in our community, we're surrounded by highways, or we have the railroad tracks, we have the industrial areas, we have the recycling plants, the garbage landfill. So if you see those areas in more common parts of a city, those are observational things you can eye out, and those are usually the areas where those communities were redlined, because redline communities were also not regulated. So that's why those areas are in those parts of a city. So if you go into an area that as an under-resourced area, as a high poverty area, those were probably the communities in Orlando, for instance, that were redlined. So just as Lene's point too, you can see these maps. In our area, we have historically Black and brown communities, and we had an historically Asian community until they were pushed out due to Japanese internment camps. And so all their capital was sold off. But so when you see those historically brown and Black communities, those are also markations of areas that were also redlined too.
All right, thanks you guys. Jordan had a question.
So Reggie, you brought up a really good point about the identifying identities. And I was just curious about how should journalists identify themselves? That like, should they explain to sources or the people that they're speaking with about their own personal identities? If they're, if so, and if there's like ways to be able to do that without making it all about the journalist? Because that's always been my fear in speaking with folks that, we could share some personal identities, but I don't know when there is a time and a place to be able to express that.
Yeah, I think that brings another an earlier issue. Some that I wanted to point out with my talks with journalists is I don't really know what the phases are in terms of when we're meeting, because I meet with journalists every time, so I don't really know usually if it's not directed, like what's the informal part, what's the formal part. So I kind of assume everything is formal. But I do like when there is a phase where I get to talk to a journalist, where if it is informal or something. But just providing that space and say, let's talk about who we are, let's introduce ourselves. And just setting that stage. I know for me, I should have said my pronouns are he, him pronouns, masculine pronouns, stuff like that. It sets the stage when you're talking, but also makes me someone who, as an elected official, as someone who constantly gets hit up about media requests, is allows me to feel comfortable and understand who I'm talking with and whether this dynamic is going to work going forward. Because I've encountered journalists where that there is no vulnerability. I've been a teacher, and I know that helps form a strong relationship with my students when I am being vulnerable with my students and my parents and the communities I serve. And so just making that space allows for a strong relationship to be built. And for me, for one, allows me to feel comfortable talking to a journalist because they were vulnerable. But again, I know that you have standards of objectivity, ethical practices. So I'm not too sure what those practices are, not being a journalist. But just from the other side, yeah, that's how I'd appreciate it. I wouldn't mind if we had those discussions. You're on mute.
Oh, just thank you, Reggie. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a great question.
All right, Sporty.
Hi, I have a question about heat response, and Lene, probably you can help me answer this, and maybe you can add too. We've been like talking about how communities have faced the hardship of, just adjusting to the heating temperatures in their surroundings, and especially last year in the Pacific Northwest, we saw, like you mentioned, people like just went to hotels and booked. And that shot up the prices, etc. So these are like really reactive responses, right? So considering what you showed us about the projections that are going to be by the mid-century, what should communities and governments be doing to kind of not respond to it, but actually kind of adapt to it, like at a very, homeowner levels?
Totally. So, and first of all, I think your observation, it aligns really well with recent work that I was looking at a national or at an international level, thinking about what heat adaptation is actually happening. What is not what we're saying we should do, but like what is actually happening. And for the most part, pretty much everywhere, the big thing that's happening is this thing we call coping. And that is basically exactly as you're saying, people kind of autonomously responding in the moment, rather than trying to think about, these projections, thinking about what's happening in the future. And at the individual level, that can be really hard, especially if we're thinking about this from the equity angle, because you have so many things that you're dealing with in your day-to-day life that it's like, I'm not going to think about heat that maybe will happen with a probability of 1 in 20 in a year, right? Like that's just so not on your radar in terms of your level of priorities. And so, especially from the equity standpoint, when we're thinking about what does it mean to actually move people from the coping category to the resilient, able to respond adapting category, I think that is going to be where it's really important when we start having at the high level our institutions coming in, whether those are government institutions, or I think there's also a really big role for nonprofit and private sector there as well. I think we often forget about the private sector, especially in heat adaptation. But yes, to your point, again, my angle is much more at the household level, thinking about the structure of the home, So a lot of the research I'm looking into are things around weatherization. There's been a lot of big movement in terms of funneling money into weatherization with a lot of, at least at the federal level, the kind of laws that have been passed recently. And so that has primarily been through a couple of different avenues. At the federal level, our big program is called the Weatherization Assistance Program. That is managed through the Department of Energy. The Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which is managed through the Department of Health and Human Services, also provides weatherization services. And then again, thinking about private-public partnerships, a lot of utilities provide weatherization, a lot of nonprofits provide weatherization. And then I think when we start to go into the equity standpoint, again, there's a difference between weatherization that is more or less a gift, it's a grant, versus loans versus other financing options. And so weatherization is just one option. I think that one tends to get a lot of traction because it is something that there's a lot of research on in terms of the impacts of it in reducing exposure to the elements. Also, there's an aging in place component, which is really cool that I don't think a lot of people talk about. So that's one solution that's out there. I think there's a lot of discussion we can have in terms of how do you administer those programs and scale them up, and what does it mean to just put money into the program without increasing capacity on other fronts. But this is kind of a very long-winded answer to say that yes, we are definitely in the coping standpoint, but I think there's a lot of movement happening to try to do long-term, not only infrastructural changes, but creating some of the social networks as well.
Thanks, Lene. Reggie, if you didn't have anything else to add, I'll go on to Maher's question.
No, I just responded in the chat.
Okay.
Hi, thank you both so much. I have a question for both of you. Lene, I think you touched on this a bit. You raised a few questions in my mind, but I was just wondering, based on the things that you look at, housing and energy and weatherization, what are things that perhaps aren't being discussed in mainstream media that you think are, enormous gaps on a grassroots level? I think many of us work in local journalism. So what are some issues or solutions that you see that aren't really being covered by the press that we could all benefit from digging into more deeply? And then Reggie, for you, you did mention a lot of journalistic practices that we could do better, and just being more transparent and being more human in our interactions. I think that's all very important. But also I was wondering whether there are stories that you feel are not reported on, not just the community's response to these stressors and challenges, but also just certain issues that are overlooked in the discourse on climate, because they involve communities such as yours, and not more affluent communities where we see a lot of this funding trickling down to.
Yeah, thank you. Is it Maher?
It's Meher.
Thank you, Maher.
I just wanted to give you both those questions and you can both answer.
I'll go ahead and take it because this is a long one, so I make sure I forget my piece. And then answering that first part, what are things that are not discussed in mainstream? I just go back to kind of our body innovation approach is talking about the history. In my career as a teacher, a governing board member, and even doing this work, is a lot of the understanding of why we are where we're at and why we have inherited this crisis, right? It didn't just happen in my generation. I'm a millennial. It didn't just we didn't create this situation. The previous generation didn't create it, but it continues to compound, and we continue to pass it on to the next generation. But for our students and for everyone else too, right? There was a question about redlining, is really teaching that history, the history of people of color and the struggle that they have had to gone through, right? The good and the bad, teaching about those racist practice of the authority of these institutions that from the get-go, from the jump, never meant to serve us and create environments for us to thrive in. And when we talk about redlining, we can then talk about environmental racism and why our communities are not built for to be advantageous for our survival, but more so to be disadvantaged for us to be able to thrive and be as innovative as we're supposed to be. But that's what we just go back to, is teaching about what white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism have done to our communities. These are the systems, right, that our nation dominant systems in our nation, and so that's where we go to. But again, talking about redlining, this infrastructure failure, why our communities look the way they do, so that people can then begin to understand and break apart from that fatalistic view of their community and say, okay, how can I be the change in my community? And then also in terms of connecting them to solutions and also getting their vision. When we talk about centering people of color, though that part of your question asking about those stories that are not told, right? It's the stories of the Black trans woman trying to step outside of her house and just knowing that she's going to face issues because of her identity, but also that's being compounded by living in an under-resourced community. That's being compounded if you're in South Phoenix, that you're probably not being able to be employed, and you're probably having to step outside when it's 115 degrees, and South Phoenix doesn't have public transportation. It's just getting built here. Now you're going to have to walk to work. And so when we talk about those stories, it's like they're not just dealing with the heat, they're dealing with so much more. And those are the stories that need to be told. And then also asking, and when I get asked this question, I love is, what is my vision for the future? And that vision is based on the issues I faced as a queer Latino. But for someone who's living with a disability, for someone who has a different identity that is experiencing more struggles than I will ever know or can even fathom, it's asking what is their vision? Because I promise you, they'll blow your mind away about what they've already thought of how their community should look like.
Thank you, Reggie. And Lene, also, I had a question for you as well. Reggie, I really appreciate that. I think that informs my reporting a lot more.
Totally. Yeah. So I guess on the point of what is missing, or what I would love maybe for kind of people to keep in mind, is that doing things like weatherization, doing these maybe longer term adaptation strategies is hard. Like, I think a lot of times people are like, oh, we put all this money into it and that's that. We gave it the money. But it's like, actually the act of doing these kinds of things, especially if you are trying to target the people who need it the most, is very, very difficult. And it is difficult from administrative reasons. It is difficult just from the standpoint of that person having the time and the capacity to kind of go through the hoops to do the solutions. And so oftentimes it's a lot easier to, especially like, again, thinking about something like weatherization, like it's pretty easy to weatherize high income homes, to weatherize medium income homes. It's really hard to weatherize low income homes, right? You need that person to be able to fill out a bunch of paperwork. You need that person to be able to be at home, so you could do an energy audit, to be able to do the updates themselves, to come back at the end to do an inspection. Like, it's a multi-day process. And so then that person needs to know their work schedule. They need to be able to be there while the other people are there, feel comfortable having these people in their home. And so the actual act of doing that is just like very difficult. And I think we get so lost in the money side of it that then when maybe things don't happen, people are like, oh, it didn't happen. But it's like, it's really hard to make this thing work on the ground. And so I would love to hear just like more conversation in terms of like, what are other ways that we can start pushing these things forward, and how else, what other wheels need to be greased, what other capacity needs to be built, so that way, you know, if we're trying to do equitable adaptation, we can get it going, and there's transparency in terms of, you know, what's slowing down the process, what's making this actually difficult, so that when, if things don't happen, people are like, oh, it didn't happen, but it's like, the money alone wasn't going to solve the problem. There were other issues there. So I think that's one thing that I think a lot about in terms of how you actually make equitable adaptation happen on the ground, and not just talked about in the abstract, right? I think another thing, especially when we're talking about what adaptation means in relation to other systems, is like, you know, these things are connected. Housing, displacement, how can we make sure that we are, when we're updating a home, that person can keep living there. Our rent prices in Miami are absolutely insane. And so there's different things that, you know, whoever's giving the weatherization program, whether it's the government or the utility, they can do to try to keep the renters, especially in a home. But it's really hard, because a lot of times, if you own a home and you're not living in it, and it gets improved, then you want to be able to get more money from it, right? Because it's now a nicer unit. And so there's that component too of gentrification and displacement and getting market rate housing, updating market rate housing and making sure that the people who need it can live in there. So I think there's that component of it too. I took a couple of other notes. And then one thing that I think, this is actually something that I think is on a research horizon that I would love to see more research on is what does it mean for a lot of our places that are kind of dealing with the chronic heat question. I think a lot of times the focus is on episodic events. It's like a massive heat wave happened in the Pacific Northwest, or a massive heat wave happened in New York City, and that had a huge big mortality event that we can directly attribute to that heat wave, right? But I think there's developing research in terms of what does it look like for these chronic heat places like Arizona, places like Miami, places like Orlando, where, you know, we've been dealing with heat. And I work a lot with community members as well. And sometimes I'll go to commission meetings and people are like, why are we talking about heat? Heat's not a problem. But I know it is, because there's these community members that I work with, and it is their problem. And so I think there is this question of, as we move forward in a changing climate, what is the limits we're going to be reaching in terms of, at that chronic level, at the everyday in summer, you're dealing with this problem consistently. You know, what are people going to be able to deal with, and are people going to have to move? Like, I don't think we've had that discussion, and I think that, again, is at a horizon where the research is not quite yet there. But I think is going to be a really important question moving forward.
Thanks, Lene. And I swear I'll leave time for other questions, but I have a question. OSHA, I'll get to you right after I ask mine, but I thought this would be a good place, based on what you were just saying, Lene, and to maybe first get Reggie's thoughts on this, because one thing we were curious about when putting this panel together was what is going on at like a local, municipal, or even state level, and just so everyone knows how this panel came together. There was originally going to be a third person from the Phoenix Office of Heat Response and Mitigation, I think is what it's called. It's a relatively new effort. That person is on paternity leave, so it was unavailable. And I think it speaks to how big that department is, that there wasn't a really good alternative suggested. And then I tried to go to the Arizona Department of Health and Human Services, and they were in the midst of a giant election you may have heard about, and nobody wanted to talk to a bunch of journalists. So those voices are missing. And Reggie, that means you have free reign to say whatever you want about them, but I'm just curious what you think about what is going on at the government level in Phoenix to try to address this, because as OSHA brought up, and Joan, over 300 people died last year from heat-related causes, and this is something that's not going away. And then maybe, Lene, you can tell us about, perhaps there's some communities in this nation or states that seem to be really proactive on this. I think it'd be great just to hear that.
Yeah, so our city is just, I can't even say the state as a whole. Our city is just beginning to walk this walk of environmental justice and what it means to be committed. So in that sense, I'm proud of my city, city of Phoenix, starting the Office of Heat Mitigation, but also just having, what the role of the city can do is just having a big picture plan. They have the resources, they have the experts, and that helps us at the grassroots level understand what is that big picture plan, and what are the gaps that need to be filled into. As a person of color, as someone who's living in a community that's been cut off from these resources, but they can always do better. So for instance, they've created cool corridors, which is what our organization's doing. But what the work that we're doing too is just the difference is, like, they're creating cool corridors, which to increase tree canopy, But for our organization, we're very focused and taking a lot into consideration when we're doing environmental justice work, meaning that, yes, we do need trees, but we're in the desert, so that we can't have weeping willow trees. We can't have olive trees. So for some reason, our city manager loves olive trees, and so we have olive trees everywhere. But it's like those take a lot of water, and if you're trying to plant in a place like South Phoenix, you can look at Tucson if you're interested in the story. I look at 2 case studies, Tucson and Phoenix, completely different approaches. But in Tucson, you won't see those kind of like landscapes that require a lot of water. They're very in love with the desert landscape. But what that means is they're not spending a lot of money on their water bills, like the city of Phoenix is. And then also too, when we talk about continuing to center and prioritize those most impacted by the problems, those are the communities too. And so when I got invited out to one of their co-corridors, it was in a more affluent community that did have trees. Yes, they still needed tree coverage, but for me, we could have listed 5-10 different zip codes that were more in need of these trees than the community that they had chose to plant in. And so I think the city can always do a better job. I'm proud that they're just starting this work and have created that department. But there still needs to be, like you have talked about, they're still very hard to be accessible, that those staff and the resources that they provide, and then fulfilling those promises too. And so again, when we talk about like, they have that big picture, which allows us to, okay, this is where they're headed, and this is how we can augment that work. But it's also like accessibility is another challenge when we're dealing with like government officials, and then those in organizational work are those community leaders who are trying to tap into those resources, because it oftentimes is very hard to access those individuals, access the resources, or find those resources to continue to do this work.
I can talk a little bit about what's happening here in Miami because I'm fairly involved with that. So Miami 2021 around, I can't remember what, I think it was like in the summer, we had our first chief heat officer chosen for the county. So Miami's weird because there's like the city and then there's the county. The county's much larger. And part of that was they also created a heat health task force. I'm on the task force, as well as several community partners, people in industry, people who are urban landscapers. Like, it's a really diverse group who are trying to think about heat adaptation and heat solutions in Miami-Dade County at the local level. And so one of the things that we did was this past year, we really were kind of focused on getting information about different adaptations and solutions that people were interested in, getting feedback on what kinds of things work in Miami, what kinds of things don't work in Miami. Miami is a really vibrant, multicultural place. And so there's just like a lot of different competing interests in terms of what different people want to see happening with their communities, which is great because it makes our community really, really rich and different, but it also can sometimes make things a little bit challenging. And so we focused a lot on information gathering, and now are kind of transitioning into thinking about a heat action plan. They're working on that right now. I'm not part of that process. And so at the county level, we're kind of very much, I think, in a similar stage as where Reggie was talking about. Really, people are super excited about this and pushing it forward, but kind of, I think, in the earlier stages of it, at least at a formal level. And then in terms of heat adaptation from other sources, Miami is really special, I would say, in the climate space, because it is, I think, really fundamentally grassroots here in a way that I was in California before, and they had really strong grassroots too, don't get me wrong, but I think just the need for it here in Miami is so strong because there's a lot of lack of leadership at the state level on the climate issue. And so I think that kind of creates that environment for it at the local level, in doing kind of climate work in a state like Florida. And so I just think that at the local level, a lot of organizations, and I'm happy to connect you guys with some of the organizers who are working on heat issues here in Miami, are doing really cool work. And thinking about, you know, in a place like Florida, again, in Miami, where we're dealing with chronic heat, it's slightly different than in other places. So it's happening from different places. People are pushing it forward, but I think it's definitely kind of still in its developmental phase.
All right, thanks to both of you for entertaining my whim. OSHA, now the journalists have control again, so you're up.
Yeah, this is a question mostly for Reggie, but Lene, also, if you have an answer, that'd be great too. My understanding of the origins of redlining is that it was explicitly race-based at the beginning, and then they shifted once the Supreme Court said you can't do it like that. They shifted and used euphemisms, but that it has its origins directly in race and really nothing else. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Again, we just have to go back to for me, and it's about white supremacy. Going back to these resources were never meant for us, and so when we talk about redlining and stuff, just like those practices exist now, those racist practices exist now, and they're continuing to exist, and we have to continue to be watchful and vigilant about how those practices are adapting to this new society and still playing out too, right? Because it's all coded, it's subtle, but we're still having to navigate those kind of practices. And it was explicit to race, and in some ways, somehow now, if what we're seeing them now, they still are tied to race. But again, it's being vigilant and how that is, what sleight of hand they're using to continue to push these and perpetuate these kind of policies and these strategies to continue to cut off resources from communities that have historically been excluded from these resources.
All right, thanks, Reggie. Amy had a question.
I just was curious about what you were saying, Lene, about episodic heat versus chronic heat. And I just was curious about, you know, what kind of research there is about people who are exposed to chronic heat, you know, and obviously people, you know, who are exposed to episodic heat can suffer from heat strokes and things like that. For people who are exposed to chronic heat, are there chronic health consequences that are documented that are associated with that?
Yeah, so great question. This is definitely an emerging area of research. There are a couple of, I think, key places that hint at the real significance of chronic heat. One of them is renal damage for people who are chronically heat exposed during work. They have kidney problems basically later in life. So there's a lot of research on that front. And then otherwise, I think like that is very much something still developing. We also have research in, again, mostly from the occupational standpoint about, you know, people, if, for example, they are going home to hot houses and not able to fully kind of reset, that has implications for work accidents the next day. So there's kind of that component of it as well, which is like, it's not only just the long-term physical effects that it might have on somebody, but it has kind of more mental effects as well, that it can influence things like job performance. But it's definitely one of the growing areas of research that I'm excited to see people exploring more.
All right, thanks, Lene. Mara had a question.
Yeah, thanks you two so much for being here. So I'm a reporter in New Hampshire, and in this state, a lot of the environmental justice issues that people have historically organized around, and there's like a lot of community engagement over, our legacy pollution issues like PFAS contamination in water or lead pollution in our housing stock. And I'm wondering, I see some of those organizations like making climate connections between legacy pollution issues and climate issues, but I'm wondering if you see connections between those kinds of issues and the structural violence we're talking about in terms of heat and like, you know, all of the systems we're talking about involved in mitigating or responding to heat. You know, do you see connections there? And then also in your work, like, are you making those connections between sort of like historical environmental justice pollution issues and the climate crisis?
I'm sorry, Mark, can you rephrase the question? Are we seeing connections?
Yeah. I guess like when you're talking in your communities or doing your research, like are you making connections between other kinds of environmental justice issues like pollution issues or like lead poisoning, for example, and climate issues related to heat and housing, for example?
Yeah, I think Lene touched on this earlier is like this work with like increasing affordable housing, access to housing. It's connected, right? And when we talk about pigeonholing environmental, these issues like the heat island impact, it's connected to a whole host of other issues like affordable housing. But understanding the built environment and understanding redlining, segregation, and knowing like when we think of NIMBYism and knowing why this stuff is put in my own backyard. We have to talk about the quality of life and why you can be in South Phoenix and zip code 85004 and have a 10-year life expectancy that is again 10 years lower than a more affluent community in Scottsdale, which is a community in the north, and understand that why our community suffers from higher rates of asthma, poor health outcomes than those more affluent communities. Because yes, we're living near more, living next to the freeway, living next to these kind of areas that have been historically allowed to have these entities like industrial zones, have the garbage landfills that have continued to like pollute our communities, not historically not having infrastructure, basic infrastructure like sewage, plumbing. It was back after World War II that Black and brown veterans came back with a new understanding of their power to say, you know what, we need to fight for our communities to be better because we've had this power. They had this new sense of pride in coming back to the communities and understanding like, wow, we just traveled across the world for this, and we're coming back to this, and really saying like fighting for these basic amenities that other communities had, right? And like our communities back in the 40s and 50s didn't have plumbing, and we're dealing with living in their own fecal matter, which is like a very basic measure of how bad government treats their certain community members when they're not willing to provide those resources to collect that stuff, right? Which causes disease. But again, that's all connected, right? When we talk about environmental racism, and again, I had touched on that, which is an area, as I describe, an area that is built to be disadvantageous to the community members that live there. It's the heat island impact is just one metric, but again, there's asthma. There's having to live where in an area where historically they were allowed to pour their waste into the communities. We have 14 landfills next to one of our most precious water sources, which is the Rio Salado. But all that stuff I think has to be considered and talked about, because where I go and I talk to someone who just wants to talk about the heat, I have to talk about all these other stuff that have contributed to other poor health quality outcomes too. And again, that's going into the history, and that's why I always urge, and that's why I always talk about is we have to talk about the history of how this happened, the history of why this happened, to understand why we're in this present moment, and why, again, with your identity and everything else, why you can step outside the door, and the issues and the struggles you're facing in the society you're living in are just compounded on top of each other.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess just on a couple points around this theme in general, air pollution and heat together is a really toxic maybe not the right, but harmful duo. So they exacerbate each other, and when people are exposed to them together, health outcomes are much more unfavorable than them in isolation of each other. And so I talked about this a little bit from the standpoint of outdoor workers, but actually there was a really interesting study that came out fairly recently. And I remember that one of the things they found was that there was a sort of trade-off happening in places that were exposed to wildfire smoke, where they were maybe a household that was not really using air conditioning, or maybe it was expensive, or for these other reasons that we talked about. And so they would traditionally rely on natural ventilation. But then when there's smoke outside, you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to leave your window open. And so there's this trade-off happening between, do I choose the smoke or do I choose the heat in my home? And so I think another thing we're going to have to start talking about a little bit more, again, is those trade-offs, particularly in these low-income homes, of like, which hazard are you going to be willing to deal with? And so I can send you that paper if you want to follow up with me. It was really interesting. And they, if I remember correctly, they showed that it was basically like, if you were in a cooler home, you also were in a home that had less wildfire smoke. It was like these things are kind of compounding on each other. And to your point about the energy side of things, kind of my conceptualization in working model of heat is that one of the reasons, at least from the indoor perspective, it's so kind of deeply inequitable is because it is tied again to your housing, your ability to afford air conditioning and things like that. And that is for all the reasons we've talked about, racially connected and connected to your socioeconomic status. And so, you know, when we're kind of thinking about then the role of energy, a lot of homes that are placed by energy infrastructure, when we think about this, Cancer Alley is what it's called, in like the Gulf Coast, you know, those are places that are also poor. And so it's kind of this like intersectional vulnerability, I think, is what's coming through. And so heat really challenges communities that are dealing with these intersectional forms of vulnerability, because it has to do with how good their housing is. It has to do with if they can afford their energy bill. And so I think that is kind of the avenue in which heat is a little bit different from some of the other hazards, because if you live in a really well-maintained home and you can afford your air conditioning, it's not really a problem for you, and you're not working outside, right? And so it's kind of, I think, looking through that intersectional vulnerability angle and realizing that a lot of the communities that are kind of intersectionally vulnerable are also next to our energy producing infrastructure. And so I think there's that connection there.
Thanks, Lene. Let's see, Caroline is up next with a question.
Yeah, I guess one thing that I've been curious about lately that I felt like you guys might be able to speak to is, I think there's been coverage recently about with disasters, especially hurricanes and wildfires, homeowners insurance going up. But I'm curious if you're seeing ways that those type of disasters are affecting renters, since they're not the ones carrying the burden of homeowners insurance. What are the ways that renters are experiencing those impacts of climate change?
I'm not able to provide you a nuanced response to that question. I know for me, when I think of thinking of displacement, the word displacement comes to mind when it comes to renters. I'm still thinking of like that comes to having access to affordable housing, which a lot of the communities I live in don't have access to, right? Which leads them to rent. But for me, it just comes back to a case of affordable housing, and that being one of the most direct, being a solution to have for people to have access to the energy that they need, to have access to cooling areas, to have a stable life, to be able to thrive. Most renters, when we talk about affordable housing, all your money is going towards that, and then when you live in an underserved community, on top of that, we're experiencing displacement. In doing the work, I also have to be conscious of what we call green gentrification, right? Something that I fought so hard for is the light rail. South Phoenix has historically had the highest public transportation ridership, yet and when I say we just getting the light rail, that is an injustice in itself. But I'm losing my train of thought. I fought for that, but at the same time had to be conscious that this type of infrastructural project will actually probably will push people out of their house, not being able to afford, because it will raise rents. And I know that the city, in the work that they're doing, is putting more resources into this because they see South Phoenix as a new up and coming profitable area, where the work I'm doing is trying to keep community residents that have been historically in their community, in their houses, in their community. At the same time, I'm still combating that this same type of work that I'm doing can actually push people out of their work. It can actually lead to further displacement. So in terms of the disaster and the renter response, I can't provide a nuanced response to that. But in terms of displacement, I'm thinking of like displacement's going to happen, and the new type of, when we talk about how this work, just the issues we're dealing with just perpetuate and evolve. I'm thinking now green gentrification, of like still being conscious of that this work can lead to further displacement of the community I'm trying to help and trying to empower still.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I live in Tucson, and actually right now there's like a coordinated effort to fight the public transportation going into South Tucson, basically on that basis to stop displacement. And it's like that makes me think about how fascinating it is that a community would organize around stopping something that is useful actually, but that staying in place is more important.
Yeah, I guess to quickly add to the renter side of things, I'm also less in the insurance space of things, but how I'm seeing the renter owner side of things kind of emerging in the work is two different avenues. Both of them are kind of rooted in what we as academics call like the split incentive or principal agent problem. And basically what that means is that the incentive of an owner, so a homeowner in this case, is very different from the incentive of the renter. And that's because in a lot of times, there is the case where the renter could be paying their energy bill and that is included in their rent, or it could be the case that the homeowner is paying it. And so those have very different ramifications, because if the renter is paying for the energy bill, then the homeowner has no incentive for energy efficiency improvements because they are not footing that. So that is kind of the nature of that side of the problem. And then another part of it is like when we are trying to do things like weatherization or home-based adaptation solutions, particularly for, again, low-income communities, if you are a renter, you don't get to choose what happens to the house, right? Like the owner of the home has to be okay and on board with going through this process of doing weatherization and updating the home. So oftentimes it's really hard to get market rate rentals updated because you have to get the owner involved in that process. And a lot of times, again, the owner does not really have an incentive to do that. They're not paying the energy bill. It's not really something that they need to do. So that is kind of, from the heat perspective and the housing perspective, another way that renter versus owner tensions, I guess, are at play.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both. We have time for one more question. And so Ashley, yes, there is time and you get to ask it.
Thank you. And thank you both so much for your time. So Reggie, you spoke about the importance of history and reporting, and I totally believe that as well. Something I do struggle with as a white journalist is when I might be going too far into the history to where it might re-traumatize a community I'm reporting on. And so I think that you've spoken a little bit about this on and off throughout this presentation, but if there's any last perspectives on how to keep historical context from being exploited, I would love to hear that.
For me in the work I do, I know that for me, I'm comfortable because of my connection to telling my own history, being a descendant of indigenous people from Mexico, being half Spanish too. So that's the history I'm comfortable telling. I would say for you in doing this is connecting with the people who represent that history that you're trying to tell, and then consulting with them about the type of what historical policies, laws, individuals should be included in this piece. Because yes, that is a justifiable concern. Something that sometimes I don't even watch shows or movies because I know that I will be re-traumatized by what I know I will expect to see in that or an article. But definitely I'll say consult from the members of those groups whose histories that you're trying to tell in the work that we're doing too. That's what we do. We consult with indigenous partners, with African American partners, queer partners, to go over this history, making sure, again, are we the best people to tell this history? Are we the best people to tell this anecdote or anything? And most of the time, it's a no, that we're not, and we need to reach out to other people who are connected to that history and let them come out and tell the story themselves. But that's what happened. And then for me though, Two, being a history teacher, being someone who just went through my whole public education where these aspects of the truth were kept away from us, hidden from us. For me, that's what I search for, the truth. So ultimately, I just want to know what the facts are and what the truth is, right? And what the varying accounts are. And so that's something ultimately that I'm appreciative of, is just telling me the truth of the situation, because for so long I navigated this road not really understanding the full picture, understanding one perspective, one dominant perspective of how events played out, and just telling myself, make it make sense, because it doesn't. But that's my advice. Thank you. Great question.
All right. Well, folks, can you join me in thanking Lene and Reggie for being here with us today? Here's your round of applause. We truly appreciate your time and just the expertise and stories you shared with us. I should warn you that all these journalists are getting your contact info, so you're very likely to hear from some of them again.